They briefed him in a windowless room that smelled like old coffee and new lies. Captain Jarek Thorne sat straight-backed while the hollow cast a glacial blue over his scars and the counselor's voice crawled across the table like frost. Satellite sweeps, thermal blooms, a confirmed brood. A dragon matriarch, wounded but breathing. 3 newborns tucked under her wings somewhere amid the obsidian ribs of a dead volcano on Vespera 9. The words were clinical, denatured, boiled down until you could pour them into forms. He watched the heat signatures pulse in the hologram, 1 large, 3 small, and felt the old thing in his chest rise like a bruise under a thumb. Retribution, the counselor said, as if the word were sterile. For Shira Prime, for the ships we lost at Kintal's Gate, for your brother. They said his brother's name without flinching, as if grief were a key that still turned. Jarek kept his face a locked door. They didn't know that rage had a half-life, that it decays into something heavier and harder to carry. He took the rifle anyway because that's what his hands knew. Orders made a shape his body could still fit. The shuttle punched down through cloud like a nail driven into glass. The Vespera 9 rose to meet him in black plates and knife-bright gullies. Lava had cooled to obsidian sheets that caught the pale sun and threw it back indifferent. The volcano's flanks were streaked with the ash of other people's mistakes. On final descent, the terrain scanner drew a heartbeat on the display. 4 pulses tucked into a cavity high on the mountain's north face. The sea, a pane of hammered steel, breathed at the horizon. When the landing skids kissed rock, the shuttle shuddered as though the world disliked being touched. Jarek stepped into wind that smelled of salt and stone and something faintly sweet beneath the ash, like burned resin. The rifle's weight settled against his shoulder in the old familiar way. A cliff path slashed upward, narrow as a scar. He climbed, breath measured, boots finding the rhythm of a man who had always made peace with bad footing. Far below, the ocean smote the cliffs and kept not one of its promises. The den announced itself, with heat before sound. An exhale from the earth, a remnant of the volcano's old appetite. The entrance was a broken mouth in the rock, spiked with black glass fangs. Inside, light skeined across the walls where plasma had licked them smooth, and the air held a copper tang that made his tongue remember blood. He slipped through shadows that kept their own counsel and came to the chamber where the thermal bloom had been pulsing since orbit. She lay there like a continent that had tried to become smaller and failed. Scales the color of moonlight through thin ice, flaked and dulled by pain. 1 wing half spread, trembling with the memory of flight. Eyes that had once learned the shapes of starfields now slit to drink in a single man in a doorway. Her breath grated. Cauterized wounds webbed her chest in a map drawn by someone who disliked maps. Against her belly, 3 pale knots of life shifted and pressed closer to heat. He lifted the rifle. The world got very simple and very far away. The sight cut the distance to a tidy fraction. 1 squeeze. 1 correction written onto the ledger. The dragon mother angled her body without rising, a slow laboring heave that pulled more of her wing across the hatchlings. The gesture was unromantic and undeniable. For a heartbeat, Jarek saw not a weapon of extinction, but a creature that had instinct left when everything else had been taken. Cover them, even if it breaks you. He tried to imagine his brother's face and found only a blank space where memory had burned too hot. The barrel drifted a hair. The hatchlings moved, a tangle of thin limbs and translucent winglets, muzzle tips like pearled beads. 1 slid free, scrambled over the web of the mother's forelimb, and staggered toward the only upright heat in the room. It came on unsteady feet, chirping in a register that wasn't made for human ears, but found human bones anyway. It came because small things go toward warmth, because newborns negotiate with the universe by stumbling into it. It stopped at the toe of his boot, sniffed the scorched composite, and, in a gesture so guileless it felt like violence, pressed its face against the armor, as if greeting a cliff that might remember how to be kind. Jarek's finger tightened, then refused him. The rifle weighed too much, then not enough, then nothing at all. A hand that had found 1,000 triggers found a pause instead. Somewhere behind his sternum, grief and anger, those old conjoined twins, shifted away from each other by a width no one would see. The mother did not roar. She watched, gold narrowing to thin coins, muscles tuning for the breath that could write him out of existence. The hatchling nosed the seam of his boot with the absurd confidence of infancy and made a sound that could only be translated as "I am here." "Are you?" For the first time since the council had spoken his brother's name like a tool, Captain Jarek Thorne let the mission fail to fit inside him. The rifle's muzzle lowered a degree. The mission crumpled enough to show the thing underneath it that had always been there, patient as bone, a choice. Metal struck stone with a sound like a sentence ending. The rifle slid, caught against a ridge of glass, and lay there like a mistake that had learned to breathe. Jarek didn't watch it go. He couldn't take his eyes from the small weight leaning against his boot, and the enormous one watching from the floor, neither of which had killed him yet. He knelt because standing felt like an argument he didn't want to win. The armor plates along his thighs groaned. Ash sighed. He stripped the helmet, let cold air bite the ridge of the scar that bisected his hairline, and set the useless crown beside the useless gun. The den's air touched his face with the intimacy of salt wind, of heat reflected off water at dusk. He had been living inside filters for so long he'd forgotten the world had a temperature of its own. He extended a gloved hand and then, irrationally careful, peeled the glove off finger by finger. The skin beneath was a map of old work, callous and seam, the half-moon pale where a wedding band had not been for years. He turned his palm up, empty of anything that could hurt. The hatchling trilled, a sound assembled out of questions and bravado, and set one damp forefoot into his hand as if it had been made for that purpose. It was warm, impossibly so, life concentrated like a secret in a small vessel. A second foot followed. The tiny ribs worked like bellows. The heart tapped against his thumb. Its weight made him aware of the tensile strength of mercy. Behind it, a sibling with a bent wing hesitated, then came on 3 limbs, trailing the bad one like a rumor. The third hatchling kept a dutiful contact with their mother, eyes on him, measuring hazard with a seriousness that would someday turn into something else. The mother herself shifted again. The wing lifted a fraction, just enough to ease strain on a torn tendon, just enough to expose her throat. Not a weakness. An offering to a world that had not been gentle. "See what I have kept alive, decide who you are." Jarek reached with his other hand toward the bent wing. The hatchling flinched and then stilled, as if taking its cue from a heartbeat it had decided to trust for reasons that shamed him. He traced the edge of the membrane with the back of one knuckle, felt heat and damage, and the will in the tissue that wanted to knit. He had dressed burns on men in ruins and on himself in mirrors. The motions live in muscle longer than in memory. He shrugged out of the kit harness, popped the latches on his field pouch, and laid out gauze, sealant foam, a water ampoule, a tube of synthetic colostrum. Someone had added to his loadout, because a requisitions officer with a conscience had read the mission file and lied to a form. The mother's pupils flared when the sealant hissed. Jarek paused and angled the canister away so she could see it plain, let the foam swell on the stone and die harmlessly before he smoothed the smallest amount along the torn edge. The hatchling hissed. He murmured without meaning to, sound more than words, a low thread laid under panic until it had something to rest on. His hands knew how to be gentle even when his head didn't recognize the posture. He mixed the colostrum with water in a sterile tube, shook it, and cursed at how ridiculous his hands looked. Big knuckles, blunt nails, around a tool made for neonatal medbays, not caves. The smallest dragon licked foam from its muzzle, and then, catching the scent, nosed the tube with the inevitability of tide. It tasted, sputtered, latched. The little jaw worked with an intensity that claimed its chunk of the future. Jarek felt something unclench in him that had become structural. The word that surfaced filled his mouth with bitterness and sweetness both. Alive. He looked up at the dragon mother and made the slow mistake of meeting her gaze. It was like looking down a barrel that knew your name. He raised his empty hand in the quiet, the universal sign for "I have put the knife down." He pressed that hand to the floor, palm open, and moved not at all. She inhaled, long and ragged. She could have immolated him, and in that exhale paved over the crime with history. Instead, she shifted again, bringing the weight of her head closer until the scorched leather of her breath warmed his forearm. Her eyes found the tube in the smallest mouth and then the makeshift bandage on the bent wing, and then, astonishingly, the crumpled figure of the man still kneeling after a lifetime of refusing to. He had the dizzy sensation of being seen at a scale of detail only predators and mothers possess. He worked until his hands shook. He cleaned ash from narrow nostrils with the corner of a gauze. He dabbed at the mother's chest wound with saline while his brain screamed at him about distances and species and probabilities. He cut strips from the thermal blanket in his kit and built a cradle of warmth where the three could sleep, not on bare glass, but on a little scrap of kindness. He did it badly, and then better. Night crept into the mouth of the den and painted the obsidian a bluer black. The sea's voice deepened. The cold should have taken him by the collar and hauled him outside. He stayed. The hatchlings collapsed into post-feeding torpor in a tangled heap that put all of them half on his thigh, as if he were a piece of geography they intended to keep. He could feel the mother's heat on his cheek, a radiant field that made the air thin but bearable. She was dying by increments and endurance. He could count the math of it now, could glimpse the edges of a future in which three white shapes woke without the shape that had taught them the world. His helmet's comm chirped once. Range reacquired, the orbiting relay catching a sliver of mouth in the mountain, and he let it. He did not move for it. He understood that if he spoke to the ship now, his voice would come out wrong, holding a man he could not see himself being until he set the tube down and looked at what was in his lap. When he did, he didn't find absolution. He found a hatchling with sealant on its whiskers, making a squeak that meant air in the wrong place, and its siblings climbing it to get to him. Every failure of balance and surfeit of intention written in their ridiculous limbs. He found his hand on the mother's forelimb without remembering putting it there. Heat-saturating bone, a pulse that said the same thing his did in a language older than orders. Continue. The rifle lay where he had dropped it, black against black, a shadow of a shadow. Jarek didn't look at it. He leaned his head back against stone that had cooled from lava to shelter and let the fatigue arrive. He thought of the counselor's mouth making the word retribution, and of the way the smallest hatchling had pressed its face against his boot as if it knew how to read a man's future by touch. He thought of his brother, finally, not as a blood debt, but as a boy who had laughed with his mouth wide open at stupid jokes. When sleep came, it was thin and treacherous. He woke at every movement, every shift of scale on stone. Each time he came up out of it, he checked absurdly for breath. Mother, yes. 1 yes, 2 yes, 3 yes. Himself? Still. He wasn't praying. He was counting, and the count mattered. By dawn, the ocean had laid a blade of light along the horizon, and the cave breathed a little easier. The hatchling stirred and made tiny, gluttonous complaints that would have rattled him into smiles in another life. The mother's eye found him again, slower now, and held him there. He knew then, with the clean sharpness that follows a night not dying, that the mission had been replaced by something no one had paid him for. He reached for the comm, and instead of requesting a strike confirmation, said the worst and truest thing a soldier can say on an open channel. Disregard orders. I need med-evac and non-lethal containment. Send someone who remembers how to be human. The mountain listened. The ocean listened. The dragon mother closed her eye and let it stay closed for 3 breaths, because a human had finally said something worth resting in. They found him because dawn is a traitor. Light fingered the black glass of the mountain and laid a thin blade across the den mouth. The shuttle's search beam arrived after. Clinical white carving space into measurable halves. Boots scraped obsidian, the sound of procedure approaching. Jarek rose slowly so the hatchling slid to the nest of blanket without panic. The mother lifted her head a handspan and set it down again, a monarch acknowledging an audience she had not invited. Captain Thorne, stand away from the apex, a voice called, helmet filtered, impatient with the intimacy of caves. Orders are live. Confirm objective. He stepped into the spill of light so his silhouette would be undeniable. I'm changing the objective. His voice came back at him from the hot walls, thinner and braver than he felt. This is a medevac, not an execution. 3 helmets tilted because disbelief makes heads tilt. 1 rifle muzzled up because training makes hands obey while brains catch up. The youngest hatchling chirped at the noise and toddled toward the shine. Jarek scooped it without thinking and felt his name, the one on their manifest, and the one he had managed to keep inside, fuse around the tiny chest. "Captain, place the juvenile on the ground and step clear," the leader said. He said step clear the way men say mind the gap when the train is already gone. "Negative," Jarek said. "You fire in here and you cook all of us, and the galaxy wakes up to footage of a nursery you burned to be right." That made them still, the way a new variable stills a squad. The helmet cams were rolling. The mountain didn't blink, neither did the dragon mother. She would choose violence if he made the wrong sentence next. His hands shook, not from fear of the rifles, but from the knowledge that the smallest breath in his palms trusted him to be better than yesterday. He thumbed his comm and opened it to a channel he had no authority for. "Station Network, this is Thorn at Vespera 9. I'm invoking humanitarian exception under Article 12. The words tasted like an old book ripped open to the crucial page. "The matriarch is wounded. 3 neonates viable. We need containment that isn't a grave." Static crawled. Procedure hissed. Somewhere above the clouds a relay remembered how to listen. The line clicked, not just with command but with the multitudes that always leak into open channels. Shiprats on lunch break, miners eating in their cabs, insomniacs, pirates, children with contraband receivers under quilts. His voice, blunt as a wrench, went everywhere at once. The squad leader's posture changed by a millimeter, the kind that says even career men recognize when their world is being rewritten under their boots. "Captain?" he tried again, gentler now that strangers could hear him. "Stand down." Jarek looked at the mother. The pupils were slits the width of blade edges. He raised both hands, hatchling tucked in the crook of one elbow, and showed empty palms. The rifle glinted where it lay. He did not touch it. "Stretcher," he said to the squad, not pleading, not barking. "Foam cradle, no restraints, and you will walk, not rush." "I'm not losing a man to a mercy stunt," the leader said, but he gestured anyway. The second Marine shrugged off a pack and extended a collapsible litter that had carried men, and on one good day a century-old violin. The light washed everything the same color. Only the heat told the truth. Jarek stepped aside just enough that the mother could see every motion, hands, the curve of the frame, the way the blanket lay. A choreography of care. The hatchlings voiced small, outraged commentary while he transferred them to the foam. They hated the way it gave differently than his thigh. They loved the warmth. He moved like a man diffusing, not a bomb, but a lullaby. When he slid his forearm under the matriarch's forelimb to help her shift, she exhaled a thread of heat across his bare wrist. It did not burn. It sealed an oath. They carried her into morning. The mountain let them pass with the petulance of old gods. On the ledge, the wind shoved its face into theirs and tried to pick a fight. The squad leaned into it and kept their feet. Jarek walked backward at the mother's head, one hand on the foam, the other keeping a juvenile from tumbling off with the stubbornness of an enthusiast. The cameras took it all. His awkward tenderness, the squad's wary competence, the matriarch's enormous, painful dignity. At the landing pad, a med team flinched and remembered they were professionals. "We can't take that in the main bay," someone said, staring at the size of the problem. "You can and you will," Jarek said. "Seal off a wing, set the pressure warm, shut down the alarms that interpret breath as fire. Someone find me mineral salts and a neonatal dropper. And call. Call a xenobiologist who has more grief than dogma." The shuttle lifted, all throat and lift, and the den fell away, an ember the mountain would remember. Vespera 9 flattened into a bruise. The sea into a strip of hammered light. The mother's head touched his elbow twice on the climb, as if checking he was real across altitude. The hatchlings discovered weightlessness and peeped their revolutions, pinwheeling into a slow, ecstatic cluster. By the time the bay doors opened at the forward station, his name had been spoken aloud in rooms not meant to have opinions. Command suites, kitchens, a school where a teacher put the history lesson on pause and let the sound of a dragon's breath fill a room of small, curved spines. The security detail met them with weapons holstered and lawyers in tow. Someone read a paragraph out of a manual and mispronounced 3 words. Someone else lifted a latch on a containment wing that had been empty too long. Jarek staggered once when the sedative his biology had been holding at bay finally remembered its job. He caught himself on the edge of the stretcher and, for balance or belief, pressed his palm to the matriarch's jaw. She closed her eyes for the length of exactly one heartbeat. "Captain Thorne," a woman in a slate coat said, stepping into his shadow without apology. "Do you understand you are in violation of 5 separate?" Jarek looked at her, salt crusting the corner of his mouth where sea wind had dried. "If you say statutes," he said softly, "you can carry this litter." The woman shut her mouth. The squad leader smothered a smile his helmet would later deny. They moved as a single, improbable organism into the spill of sterile light. By nightfall, the station had a heartbeat it had never known. The mother's heat filled the sealed wing and made winter forget itself. The hatchlings learned the hum of life support and decided it counted as a lullaby. The Marine, who had been sent to do arithmetic with blood, lay down on the wrong side of glass with his back to bureaucracy and kept his palm on a barrier like a man warming himself at a hearth. Outside, the net listened, and the net remembers what it hears. They put him in a suit that remembered parades and called it justice. The tribunal chamber had an engineered gravity that made the unprepared sway. Glass at one end showed the cold geometry of space. Glass at the other showed the warmer geometry of the containment wing, where pale scales rose and fell in a rhythm that had retaught the station to breathe. They recited charges, each with a number like an address no one visits: dereliction, insubordination, unauthorized contact, harboring a classified threat. The words stacked until they were taller than any man. Jarek stood inside them like scaffolding and waited for the part where he was permitted to be human. The prosecutor was crisp as paper. "Captain Thorne, did you receive a lawful order to terminate a hostile apex organism and its brood?" "Yes." "Did you comply?" "No." "In your own words, why?" He could have said a dozen tactical things: exposure risk, collateral, the calculus of an enclosed space. But they would have been lies told politely. He looked past the rows of faces calibrated for neutrality and found, through the far glass, a white muzzle pressed to the line where the barrier met the floor. He wondered whether the mother understood glass. He wondered when he had started assuming she understood everything. "Because I saw who they were," he said, "not what." A murmur moved through galleries and into corners no camera could catch. The prosecutor stared, the way men stare when their opponent refuses the expected asymmetry. "You expect this body to accept sentiment as a legal defense?" "I expect you to accept sight," Jarek said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The net had already made him loud. "We call them monsters because that costs less than grief. We call it retribution because that tastes better than regret. I was sent to kill a mother and 3 newborns to reassure a story that makes us smaller. I chose not to be small." The panel president cleared his throat with the cadence of a man who has never been interrupted. "Captain, please confine yourself to procedure." Jarek finished for him without malice, like a tired man finishing a prayer he hasn't believed in a long time. "Procedure would have me shoot into a den and report success. Procedure would have me file an expense for foam and walk away from 3 bodies cooling on glass. Procedure is very good at keeping our hands busy so our heads don't have to change shape." "That will be enough," the president said, but the sentence lacked oxygen. Jarek let the silence recover and then put the last weight on the table. "I have burned cities. I have followed orders until the echo in my skull sounded like courage. My brother died at Shira. I wore that like armor and called it patriotism. He tasted the name and didn't break. When that hatchling pressed its face against my boot, it did not ask me who I'd lost. It asked me if I was here now. So here's my answer. On your record, under oath, I will not kill children to keep your stories clean." 1,000 lunches paused across 1,000 worlds. A miner wiped his palms on his pants and did not know why his throat ached. A child in a dormitory whispered the word children as if it had been smuggled into the room in a pocket. The prosecutor made a final, furious appeal to law. He called up grainy footage of outposts burning under dragon's breath and ships flensed by claws the size of harpoons. He spoke the phrase existential threat like a fire alarm. When he finished, space felt tighter. Jarek didn't ask permission to play his footage. He sent the signal, and the screens obeyed. The cave bloomed into the air above the tribunal. Obsidian, ash, the pale curve of something too big to exist in a small room, and yet there it was. The camera shook when the smallest hatchling clambered onto his hand. You could hear him breathe out once, a noise that didn't belong to soldiers. You could see, in the twitch of one pale, enormous wing, a mammal's reflex. Cover them even if it breaks you. Cover them even if the heat fails. The room changed temperature. Not by degrees, but by posture. One of the judges leaned forward in his chair, not to assert power but to see better. The slate-coated attorney who had met him at the dock pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and did not speak. The panel president looked at the glass and saw, in the reflection, his own face altered by light. When the feed cut, the mother lifted her head in the containment wing, as if she knew she'd been moved into a room that didn't deserve her and had decided to forgive the architecture. She touched the barrier with the gentlest part of her jaw. The hatchlings, bored of politics, piled like spilled pearls against the base of a heat lamp and slept. "Captain Thorne," the president said at last, voice careful on a new road. "The statutes are not written for this." "Then write new ones," Yarrick said. He wasn't insolent. He was practical. "We are very quick to make laws about killing. We can learn to make them about keeping." "You ask us to place a weapon that has killed thousands under protection?" the prosecutor snapped, fighting the tide with a spoon. "I'm asking you to meet a mother," Yarrick said, "and decide if you want to be the thing that destroys what she kept alive, just to prove you can." The chamber did what rooms do when something larger than their purpose passes through. It held, it echoed, it learned. The panel withdrew into a smaller room where the air did not trust itself. Arguments were made in low voices that sounded like men trying to negotiate with mirrors. Outside, the station's corridors filled with people who had never met each other, speaking softly, as if the ship had a sleeping child on board. The verdict came back in words that tried not to admit they were new. Suspension of sentence pending review. Transfer of the matriarch and neonates from containment to sanctuary under supervised observation. Establishment of a joint science ranger ward with authority to make calls humans could live with. Captain Thorne to remain attached as liaison, stripped of rank until further notice, given access on a leash that could be yanked at any moment. It was a compromise written by hands that trembled and hid it well. He should have felt relief. What he felt was permission to keep doing the thing that had already become the only workable religion. Show up, keep the small breathing, stand between, teach the frightened to lower their rifles and the proud to lower their chins. On his way out, he passed the glass. The mother turned her head and regarded him upside down like a child examining the world from a sofa. He rested his palm against the barrier, and the pain warmed at the point of contact, heat crossing where hands couldn't. The smallest hatchling woke, and recognizing the outline of him through light and reflection, pressed its nose to the same spot on the other side. In that foolish little symmetry, the camera caught something unaccounted for and sent it, with less ceremony than it deserved, to every corner of a galaxy, tired of being told what to fear. He had said, "Let them burn my name," and perhaps they would. But when the crowd at the station's docking ring stepped back to let him pass, it was not to spit, it was to make space, the way people do when a courier carries a light that might go out if jostled. He walked into it, hands empty, pockets noisy with the small things he had chosen to carry. A dropper, a strip of blanket, a piece of black glass from a den that had decided to be a cradle. The law would catch up, or it wouldn't. The work did not wait. Sanctuary was a promise until the station's fire logic decided to call it a lie. At 300, an algorithm mistook the matriarch's fevered exhale for a flame front and dropped the containment wing into purge protocol. Vent dampers sealed, oxygen bled, halon foam primed to eat whatever the system couldn't smother. Red strobes washed the glass in sick light. The hatchlings woke into thin air, mouths opening and closing in small, soundless pleas. Jarek hit the override and got the polite refusal of a machine that does not understand breath. The slate-coated attorney arrived with 2 guards and a rulebook. The xenobiologist arrived with bare hands and a look that meant ruin. Behind the glass, the dragon mother rose too fast for her wounds and swayed, dragging one wing over the young as if the curve of bone could teach the atmosphere mercy. "Open it," Jarek said. Captain Thorne, the attorney began, already losing the argument with her own pulse. "Protocol is killing them." He tore the emergency seal, jammed his hand into the manual bay, and cranked a wheel designed to discourage heroism. The first damper grudgingly shifted. Air slithered in like a forgiven sin. Not enough. He looked at the ranger captain. "You told me you wouldn't lose a man to a mercy stunt." "I did," the captain said. He planted both hands on the opposite wheel. "Good thing this is a team sport." Bolt screamed as the second damper broke its rusted pinion. The pressure climbed a hair. The hatchling stopped gasping and began breathing badly instead. Foam nozzles along the ceiling ticked awake, ready to unfurl winter. Jarek sealed the hood of a maintenance suit without bothering with the rest and palmed the inner lock. The door argued. The xenobiologist slammed a palm onto the mechanical bypass so hard her knuckles bled. The seal broke with a kiss like a curse. Hot, stale air slapped his face. The matriarch's heat hit him harder, a wall he had already decided to walk through. He went in with his hands up. The mother bared teeth that could open a hull and then, impossibly, lowered her head until the ridges of her brow met his shoulder. The hatchlings collapsed against his knees, frantic, crowding the suit's intake with tiny mouths. He tugged his hood loose and shoved the mask against the smallest snout. "Here," he said, hazy and stupid with oxygen debt. "Take mine." The foam nozzles coughed, spat a first silver skein. "Kill the purge," the ranger captain barked at the control pit. "Find the manual. Break the manual." Above them the roof shutters, thick slabs built to hold vacuum and opinion, groaned. The xenobiologist had rerouted 1/2 kilometer of station lungs to push warm, mineral-rich air through a maintenance duct the size of a confession. It rattled into the wing with a noise like rain in a metal forest. Not enough. The mother's pupils were pinpricks in coins of gold. She inhaled and exhaled, and the room thought about fire. She didn't make fire. She took the cold, dead air the system wanted for them and heated it as it passed her throat. A furnace turned mother warm. The frost fled the vents. The hatchling's frantic chests slowed. 1-2, 1-2, bodies remembering the old rhythm. Garrick felt his own heart flutter. Sedatives, thin oxygen, a nervous system that had been running for days without permission. The smallest hatchling made a disgruntled trill, climbed his ribs like a cliff, and pressed its narrow jaw against the spot above his heart. A faint, bioluminescent wisp spilled from its mouth into his suit, an accidental benediction. His pulse caught the cue and steadied as if embarrassed. "Open the roof," Jarek said into the chaos, calm enough that people turned their heads to find out where the calm had come from. "She can't heal in a box built to be afraid of her." "That's an exterior breach," the attorney protested. But her eyes were already on the monitors showing the pressure margins, the weather outside, the way the station's spine complained but held. The ranger captain didn't wait for consensus. He keyed the gantry, thumbed his override so hard the pad beeped in pain, and made the shutters remember daylight. A long blade of cold star poured in. The mother lifted her head into it and breathed like a mountain, long and slow, pulling the night through her and heating it until it lived. For the first time since Vespera 9, her wings unfurled to their logic. The torn one held. Barely. Jarek stepped into the lee of her shoulder without thinking and felt the old fear peel off him like a sticker that had never adhered quite right. Security arrived with weapons down and eyes up. Techs ran lines. Medics recalibrated their machines to accept the possibility of myth. In the observation ring beyond the glass, strangers pressed their hands to windows and wept without quite knowing why. "She needs real sky," the xenobiologist said, voice wrecked and convinced at once. "And those babies need ground that remembers them." Jarek looked up through the opening toward nothing and everything. "Then we stop pretending this is temporary." They moved like a small army with a better purpose. A shuttle was stripped and rebuilt into a flying nursery with heat coils and mineral mist and a ceiling low enough to feel like high hands. The matriarch crouched and allowed harnesses to settle where in another life saddles would have been. Jarek climbed the ramp, touched the ridge of her skull, and felt the rumor of flight run under his palm. "Thorn," the slate-coated attorney said from the threshold. File forgotten. If you go out that door, there's no statute left to hide behind. He almost smiled. Good. I'm tired of hiding. They launched into a corridor of escorted space and astonished silence. The hatchlings sang in small, unapologetic peeps at the black opening ahead. The mother rose with the careful arrogance of a cathedral, remembering it used to be a mountain. The station fell away, the tribunal chambers, the glass, the people who had learned and those who had not yet. The open channel filled with uncommanded audio. Kids whispering, minors swearing softly, a tired woman somewhere laughing like a person who has seen proof that her worst thought about the world was not the only one available. They swung the arc toward Vespera 9. Jarek's hand stayed where it had learned to be. On warm scale, human heat stubbornly insisting history was not over yet. Cameras caught it and sent it everywhere a signal could travel. A man who had been sent to kill flew escort for a mother and her young across a sky that had decided to make room. They returned to the black mountain that had tried to be a tomb and failed. Wind scoured the ledges clean. The sea hammered out its old argument at the horizon. Rangers in fresh painted jackets and station techs with sunburned noses had come ahead like a promise and laid a landing pad where obsidian met stubborn soil. Someone had planted mineral troughs like long, glittering rivers. Someone else had strung masts hung with chimes that spoke only when the air was safe. The shuttle kissed down and the matriarch stepped into her own gravity. She stood and did nothing at all for a long time, the way wounded things do when they're telling their bodies to update the map. Then she went forward into the den that had been a wound. Jarek followed, carrying a crate of salts with the ceremony of pallbearers and midwives both. They rebuilt the cradle where glass had once cut. The xenobiologist and two mechanics who'd learned to love quietly set thermal plates along the floor and built a condensation fall from a line that hissed softly as it learned its role. The ranger captain hammered a plaque into a rock outside the entrance and did not read it aloud. Later, people would. It said nothing about ownership and everything about stewardship, a bureaucratic miracle in 26 words. The hatchlings poured into their inheritance like water, reclaiming a course. They skittered, they slid, they leapt with the careless bravery of small things and crashed in tangles that ended in indignant squeaks and furious, melodramatic grooming. When they found the old lip of vitrified sand, now cleaned and polished, they pressed their faces to it and fogged it like a window. The smallest traced a shaky curve with its breath, a glyph that meant nothing in any human language, and somehow spelled home to every person watching. Jarek walked to the spot where he had first knelt and found ash still fine enough to remember the shape of his hand. He set the rifle down there like an artifact and stepped back. The matriarch watched, then leaned and exhaled a thin, focused heat across the gunmetal until it glowed and softened. He took it up with tongues and bent it, slow and exacting, into a ring they hung from one of the masts, a bell that chimed when the wind decided the story needed a note. When it rang, it sounded less like war and more like weather. People came. Not tourists, witnesses. A medic who had once held open a set of station doors with her shoulder so a man could commit a crime of care. A child from the mining school who had whispered children into the dark. The slate-coated attorney, who stood in the mouth of the den with her coat off and sleeves rolled, hair undone by sea wind, and did not try to name anything. The council watched from a safe, moral distance and wrote laws that were better than the ones they'd had the week before. They called it a sanctuary because there wasn't a bigger word. The charter was short. It started with Article 12 and added lines about first breath, about shared air, about the obligation to show up for living things, even when the forms said otherwise. It acknowledged that mothers of any species are to be approached with reverence and good sense. It said that if you open a roof once, you have to keep opening roofs. At dusk, the hatchlings tried flight in the place where sky had hung all their lives like a rumor. One ran and finally rose into a long, improbable glide that ended in a tumble so exuberant Jarek shouted without permission. The second took 3 steps, tripped, shook itself, pretended that had been the point. The smallest looked at him as if to ask whether bravery was a ladder or a door. He spread his hands in a shrug that meant both, and the little fool launched anyway, wings catching a seam of wind and holding, just long enough to set a precedent. The matriarch lay with her massive chin on the threshold, eyes half-lidded in the way of content predators and saints. Jarek sat beside her shoulder and leaned back until his head touched warm scale. She exhaled over him, an oven flush scented of mineral and salt and the ghost of ash, and the last iron bands around his ribs loosened, as if someone had finally found the right key. Night came in layers. Lanterns hung from the masts like low stars. The bell rifle chimed once, twice as the wind changed hands. The ranger captain boiled coffee that tasted like forgiveness. The xenobiologist fell asleep with a notebook open on her chest, and the word listen underlined until the pen had dug a trench in the paper. Somewhere in the broadcast static that never entirely leaves a world, 1,000 small screens transmitted the useless perfect feed. A man in a field of glass and salt, 3 pale hatchlings clambering over his boots, a dragon mother breathing as if she had finally been permitted to. On one of those screens, a boy who had been taught to fear what flies wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand and did not feel foolish. Jarek didn't make a speech. He went about the modest, holy work of a different kind of soldier. He mixed mineral with water. He checked the bandage that was mostly part of the wing now and would soon be only story. He put his palm to the floor where it was warm and decided that warmth counted as victory. The hatchlings collapsed in a heap against his shins. The matriarch shifted until the prow of her jaw rested, with deliberate weight against his shoulder, pinning him gently in a kindness that had once been unimaginable. He let his eyes close and did not dream of orders. He dreamed in breath and bell and wind, in a language that had finally become big enough to hold them all.